Welcome back. Still here with Jim McCormick. We are still talking Week 16, but now we are focused on the wide receiver landscape, which is going to be pretty important this week because we're not spending as much at the running back position this week. So picking the correct wide receiver is going to make or break rosters this week. But before we get into that, I do want to let you know about the big game. Game 51 promotion we got going on, rotocurve.com/big game. You can win free tickets plus fan experience events to this big game. The 4-night trip to Houston, which is February 2nd to the 6th, so mark it down on your calendars. You get 2 tickets to the big game, upgraded lower level end zone seats, VIP tickets to the San Antonio Browns celebrity game, $800 in airfare credit, the all-you-can-eat tailgate, and, of course, this pregame party with Joe Montana and Warren Moon. And who doesn't want to party with them? And pretty fitting that we're talking about this Antonio Brown celebrity game, Jim, because he's my favorite receiver this week. How do you feel about him, and who do you like at receiver?
He's at the top of my list as well. It's not just even a get-right thing. I mean, it is in the sense that, this player is too good to have this many kind of mediocre or kind of league average outcomes. But it's also just the opponent, right? I mean, the Ravens have given up the third most touchdowns to receivers. Jimmy Smith's banged up, and he's just affordable. We've seen this market shift as it's gotten colder, or as these these workhorse running backs continue to churn along. These top 4 or 5 backs that we've already discussed. They've flipped. Right? They've become the dominant expensive options, the $8,000, $9,000 options. Whereas $8,200 for Antonio and DraftKings is just so good. At home. I know we're wary to an extent of home road splits, but Pat Thorman for Pro Football Focus has done some good work. There is something going on with Pittsburgh over the last 2 seasons with regards to the speed of their offense and the pace of their offense, and that at home they run no huddle much more often and they increase their pace. Now that could also do with the fact that, just the control of the crowd, right? You have more control over the line of scrimmage with the environment, meaning less, acoustically, you can just communicate better. It's also just something they're comfortable doing. It's a trend that Todd Haley has employed for now 2 seasons. And, Pat does a great job. He's kind of like the pace guy in fantasy football in terms that's one of his main, subject matters. And so that's interesting, I think. I think that brings the volume up for Antonio. And I agree. He's like these high floor running backs. I think he's back in the mix for 22 fantasy points, and his ceiling is incredibly high. I also it's almost like Jordy Nelson to me is like the DeMarco Murray of receivers, where, you have that elite tier of Mike Evans, Odell Beckham, and Brown, and then you can dip down to Nelson for the 7K range on DraftKings, and you still get that multi-touchdown upside that we covered for tournaments, but the market share is still there for cash. Rodgers obviously has been awesome lately. Last week was his first game without a multi-touchdown game, I think, in a month, and this is the guy. This is the sideline technician and the red zone technician that Rodgers trusts. So I think Nelson is in a great spot here. And then cash, I actually like DeAndre Hopkins. The price is so good. I know we've been flirting with the Allen Robinson cheapness and even to an extent Hopkins, but last week looked like last year, didn't it? I mean, he didn't have the incredible totals, but it was a replacement level quarterback peppering Hopkins with a ton of targets, which is what got him last year's credible volume. Blake Bortles, it's the same guy, but Brock Osweiler is a below replacement level quarterback, obviously. I mean, he was, I think, last in the league in yards per drop back. He was right there with Blaine Gabbert and QBR. I mean, he was terrible. And so, Tom Savage doesn't need to be good. He needs to be league average or the 25th best quarterback in the league, which is not demanding much, but it raises Hopkins' floor. 14 targets last week. It looked like last year. I know he didn't have the huge plays, the 20-yard catches he had with Hoyer last year, but 5,200 screams cash value. I think this guy is a good bet for, 8 receptions and 90 yards. And to me, at 5,200, no one else has his volume. No one else has a 30+% market share, of their offense. And then the other guy, I actually like, 4 guys in cash. It's Pierre Garçon still. Crowder's usage is a little bit variant. They've been going to a little bit more jumbo sets. Last week, Crowder was off the field a little bit more than normal. And but Garçon is just a volume guy at this point. He's steady. Reed won't be right this year. I know we want to talk about Reed's ceiling at points, but if he wasn't right last week to get the snaps in a playoff game, essentially, I don't trust Reed, and I don't think they trust him for the snaps. I think Davis is their guy. My point being, a lot of that market share is going to splinter around. And I think this is the guy they trust on third down. He's the chain mover on third downs. 12.9 fantasy points in 5 of the past 6 on DraftKings. They're going to pass a ton. I think there's a shootout kind of element, passing wise, not that dissimilar than last week's game with the Packers and Bears. Matt Barkley's dropping back 40 times a game. So I just think there's enough of a floor here for Garcon to trust him. And between Hopkins and Garcon, you can get both those guys around $5,000 and really trust them. And then I'll let you pay up for running backs and for Antonio.
Yeah, I'm definitely on board with a lot of those picks. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins is a great call, I think. I wasn't even really thinking about that to this point. I was going to mention him in tournaments. But now that you mentioned, the quarterback change and just, how he needs someone who's league average, I think 5,200, I didn't really look at that price, all that much to this point. But I think that's a great call in cash game.
It's like Willie Snead pricing, except without that. I just think the floor is back. I think we're back at that, he's going to get 15 fantasy points in DraftKings. I just think he is.
Exactly. I think he's a fantastic cash play, and he could even be way more than that. I mean, this is a guy who's an elite talent who's just kind of getting screwed, kind of like Allen Robinson.
Exactly.
So, yeah, so I really like that call, and I'll just tell you who my cheap guy was before you said that, and maybe he's one that I still use depending on roster construction, but I believe in Cameron Meredith in this role in the offense.
Love it.
Especially against this Washington team who you look at the matchups, Josh Norman against Alshon Jeffrey. So we're kind of back to Meredith being the main target this week. And, it's not like Alshon Jeffrey just sprung him into fantasy relevance. I mean, when Jeffrey was out, he was still good. I mean, I'll give you his numbers from 2 weeks ago if I can pull them up, but I know he was still at least flirting with 20 fantasy points here. Last week, 9 catches on 13 targets for 104 yards. The week before against the Lions, he caught 6 of 8 targets for 72 and a touchdown. So it's not like, Jeffrey kind of catapulted him into the spotlight. He was getting it done before Jeffrey was back. So I know I'm a self-hating Bears guy, but I think, in cash games, Meredith is the cheap guy. We already mentioned Antonio Brown. We've kind of gone over him. And in the quarterbacks, we mentioned T.Y. Hilton, but I think it's worth reiterating that, he does miss the matchup with the big cornerbacks. He lines up out of the slot over half the time. So Sean Smith and David Amerson, who've been, arguably one of the best 3 pairs of corners in the league so far, maybe behind, the likes of the Giants and Denver. I think that this makes for a great matchup for him and him exploiting, the weak part of the defense. So I really like T.Y. Hilton this week. And he's not usually, the kind of skill set for cash games, but I think this is a cash spot for him, especially if Moncrief plays and sets kind of a decoy for him. And another guy I really like is Michael Crabtree. I mean, these Colts corners outside of Patrick Robinson, who was the slot guy, have been terrible. I mean, Vontae Davis has not been good at all this year. He's graded, I think it's outside the top 100 in terms of cornerbacks. So he's a guy who used to be dominant, but he's another guy who's had a quick fall from grace. Crabtree made a great catch last week. Both him and Cooper in great spots this week, but Crabtree's the guy I want for the cheap price. I'll save the rest of the guys for tournaments because I don't think I'm going to go there. I think we've pretty much covered the guys that I like for cash games. Outside of Thursday, I think Odell Beckham is one of the locks of the week if you're playing that. So, Jim, who do you like in tournaments?
Well, I mean, I love Mike Evans in tournaments, obviously. Who doesn't? There's been a dip here. I mean, there's a correlation here with as the Bucs defense has improved and become one of the best defenses actually over the past 6 weeks. It's not a small sample. They're up there with the Giants in terms of what they're allowing points per drive wise. Last week, I mean, they just ran into a Dallas team who's one of the top 3 offenses in the league, so it's somewhat forgivable. But I also think, that there's shootout implications in this game. I think the floor raises again in terms of what they have to do. I agree with you. Winston's not playing well, but he really doesn't have to as long as he's throwing 12 to 15 targets this guy's way. That's what the problem's been with Evans. The lack of volume. I think he's averaging 8.6 targets over the last 5 games, whereas before that he was averaging something ridiculous like 12. So that compromises his floor, but I think his ceiling remains incredibly high, especially, like we said, a 52-point over-under. You want to get a share of that. And similarly to these other guys, in that upper tier, and I think Odell's probably the most exciting multi-touchdown kind of super ceiling guy that have one of those ridiculous changes the week kind of games. But the problem is that's Thursday. It's not going to be involved in, the main tournaments, the big Saturday tournaments. But I just think Evans, you don't need to oversell it. He's got that 152 touchdown upside. I actually like Crabtree in tournaments. just because it's difficult to tell each week between Crabtree and Cooper who's going to do well. But over the last month or 6 weeks even, it's been Crabtree. He's got a 24% market share. That's like 2 or 3 percentage points higher than Cooper now. They used to be kind of even, or even Cooper was ahead of him. And Cooper is going to play the outside, and they both play outside, but he's been struggling less than 50 yards in so many outings, below 50 yards over the last 6 weeks as an average. And I just think Crabtree is the better red zone guy. It's been proven, and he's the guy he trusts on third downs as well. So I just think Crabtree has that multi-touchdown upside that maybe Cooper lacks. We don't really see that from Cooper. Michael Thomas is another guy that I really like. I think whenever he gets over 8 targets, he's basically a high-end wide receiver 1. You don't have to pay the price for it. The injury and a couple bad weeks have kind of pushed his price back down. And it's just another way to get into the Superdome. And then Julio Jones, obviously, if he plays, he was pushing off today. We all watch for these little indicators, but I think the fact that he's practiced 2 days in a row and, the way that they're discussing having him ready, it's a playoff game in a sense for them because they can really lock up the division, especially if things go their way throughout the rest of the league, or even just secure a wild card berth. And I just think it's a good week for Julio in terms of ceiling. I just don't trust him at all in cash. And then Corey Coleman, it's a weird one to go cheap.
Yes.
I like Corey Coleman's upside here. I think you're paying a cheap price, and the vertical upside's there. And then game script wise, just being home dogs. And I think he's not going to draw Hayward. That'll most likely be Terrell Pryor. I just think Corey Coleman, 21 touchdowns at Baylor last year. This guy has awesome upside. I'm all into Corey Coleman next year too in fantasy. If they could ever even get like a Brian Hoyer type quarterback in there. But yeah, it's just I think the upside is pretty spectacular as tournaments shifting. I think he could have a Tyler Lockett type effect on tournaments.
Yeah, I love that call. He was one of the guys I had in my back pocket for cheaper. He's not going to get Casey Hayward, which is,
yes,
noteworthy. He's going to get the other side of that while Terrell Pryor's dealing with him. So Corey Coleman's definitely a sneaky guy. The question is, can RG3 get him the football? And that's always the question with him. Other tournament guys that I like, pretty much everyone against Cleveland. Tyrell Williams. Joe Hayden's another guy who's had kind of a quick fall from grace so far. A guy who we considered top corner and a guy who's graded outside the top 50 or so at the position this year. So he's not a guy who's scaring me. But my favorite wide receiver in tournaments this week is probably Stephon Diggs outside of the guys that we already mentioned. I know he's struggled lately. Let's put it that way. Rudolph's kind of been the number one guy, but one of these weeks I feel like Diggs has got to break back out. And it's kind of been, you mentioned the volume. He's been a victim of the volume or lack thereof recently. He had that monster stretch earlier where it was 13, 14, 15 targets. And since that time, he's only seen 7, 8, 5, and 5. But I think they're going to be playing from behind against this Packers team, especially in Lambeau. And if that's the case, I think it's going to be another one of those where they just have to go to him finally. Again, because he's been so bad, his price has kind of been sinking. It's still a little bit higher than I'm really comfortable with, but that's why I'm fine with using him in tournaments. I think, again, if there's going to be one of these games, at least I hope there is before the end of the year, that they go back to him for 10 targets. And when they do, it's kind of the same thing that you mentioned about Michael Thomas, where he's kind of a high-end wide receiver 1 when they target him that many times. Besides that, there's only a few guys that I like. Kenny Britt against San Francisco. I think if Gurley's not going to get it done, or even if he does, even if it turns into a competitive game,
I think there's room for both. I think
exactly. I think that they want this to be sort of a concentrated offense between Gurley and Britt. The problem is on most or all weeks, one of them is ineffective, so they have to ditch one.
Right.
I don't think that this is going to be a week where they have to ditch either of them. Britt's kind of got a size and skill advantage on who's guarding him. Hold on, I'll get you a name. 1 second. I had it. Rashad Robinson. So he's got a size and advantage.
And they just lost Jimmy Ward for the season too. San Francisco is so beat up. They're down to like their third safety and they're like third and fourth corners.
Exactly. So it's not just the running defense that you can take advantage of them. And I'm kind of playing this Arizona out of the slot thing pretty much every week now. Tyler Lockett coming off catching 7 of 8 targets for 130 yards. He feels to me like a guy like Zach Ertz who just explodes at the end of every year. We know at the end of last season he exploded to the point where people were talking about him in the third, fourth round. And I think he had a big week last week, and they have to go back to him against the Cardinals. You look at that first matchup, it was week let's see where it was. October 23rd. He only caught 2 of 2 targets, but I think after the big week last week, they kind of realized what they're working with here. So he is my other tournament option. Did we miss anything at the wide receiver position?
I don't think so. I think it's a fun week for receivers. I think the affordability of these elites. We'll talk about it in roster construction because I think that there's some interesting situations.
Yeah, agreed. So before we go, though, just want to remind you, rotocurve.com/big game. You can win free tickets plus fan experience events to the Big Game 51. So go ahead and check that out, rotocurve.com/big game. We'll be back to kind of wrap everything up and discuss how we're building rosters this week. If you're accustomed to the stacks, we won't be doing that. I think roster construction is going to be a better segment, though, to be honest with you. So stay tuned.